I'm going to start this episode with a question, and please don't cheat and please don't Google the answer. What is the country with the biggest share of female politicians inside its parliament? You might be thinking right now, Norway, Sweden, maybe Great Britain. Well, if that's the case, your thinking is wrong. Because the answer, it's actually Rwanda, one of the poorest places in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure many of you already know this country, at least those of you who are as old as me, because in the year 1994, the Rwandan genocide, it appeared on every news station around the world. It was one of the biggest atrocities in mankind's history. In just 100 days, the Rwandan government brutally killed almost 1 million people. This meant that every 1 in 5 Rwandans was murdered. For decades, Rwanda, it was a synonym for humanitarian catastrophe, starvation, and it was a memory of the darkest side of the human condition. Nonetheless, 23 years later in the year 2017, Rwanda is turning into something much different.
Reflections from Rwanda, investing in one of the world's fastest growing economies.
Yep, you heard that right. Rwanda is becoming a hot topic in the financial world. A country that used to appear on humanitarian aid commercials now is starting to fill financial newspapers. And its president, Paul Kagame, has become the new African rock star, being received at prestigious places like Harvard or the Brookings Institution. Yes, of course, everyone does agree that his style is kind of authoritarian. Winning elections with over 96% of the vote doesn't exactly sound democratic, does it? But I mean, despite all of that, who can judge a man that is taking Rwanda out of poverty?
The figures speak for themselves. Since Paul Kagame came into power, Rwandans have tripled their income, and the percentage of the population that lives in extreme poverty is reducing year after year.
So now the question is, how did Rwanda end up like this? Or perhaps, maybe this is too good to be true, and is there some detail we're missing here? Today, well, we are going to answer those questions, but before we do, as usual, let's take a look back at the history, and trust me, this one is pretty intense.
Prefabricated Hatred.
Remember this date, April the 6th, 1994. On this date, the plane the Rwandan president was flying in was hit by an anti-aircraft gun. No one really knows who organized this attack, but the Rwandan army, whose soldiers belonged to the Hutu tribe, blamed their rival, the Tutsis. Tutsis were a minority inside Rwanda, living in an apartheid situation. Local media referred to them as cockroaches, and many of them had already escaped to refugee camps in neighboring countries. But no one could have predicted that the mounting prejudice would have unleashed such carnage.
Le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Nyingi, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais. Ni bake cyane. Ndetse nubwo twabariraga ku ijana, 10 ku ijana, ubwo basigara 8 ku ijana. Abantu se koko hano bitugwana tugatira inyenzi ngotanyi burundu, nazo dutira urubanza n'ububaho kuko ruzaba turarwanya kandi batsinda.
While messages like this were broadcast on the radio, the Rwandan army was passing out clubs and machetes to civilians. If any of those Hutu civilians showed mercy to his or her Tutsi neighbors, he or she would risk being executed as a collaborator. This explains why many Rwandans clubbed their Tutsi wives to death, and why even some Catholic churches became human slaughterhouses. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million people died by their neighbors' machetes. And, well, now you might be wondering, why did the Hutus hate the Tutsis so much? Were they really that different? And well, the answer, as you expect, is no. You see, many African countries have lots of different cultures and races living together. South Africa, for example, has 9 official languages. Uganda has over 15. Nonetheless, Rwandan territory was surprisingly homogenous for centuries. One single language, one single culture. The Hutus, the Tutsis, and other tribes, they lived in relative harmony. But in the 20th century, Belgium colonized this country.
One of the first policies made by the Belgian government was to force the locals to label themselves according to the tribe they belonged to. This way, it would be easier for the colonizers to identify who was who. And during the first years, the Tutsis were the tribe in charge of government institutions created by the Belgians.
Then, one day, those Tutsis started asking for independence, and that's when Belgium started supporting the Hutus with racist propaganda. This is how, when Rwanda became a sovereign state in 1962, Hutus and Tutsis had already become fierce enemies. That hatred, it was fabricated by the colonizers, and many Tutsis had to flee to refugee camps in neighboring countries. Among them was the man that you see on the screen now, Paul Kagame. Now, remember his name because it will be the key figure in this story. Paul Kagame, he was raised on one of those aforementioned refugee camps. This one, it was situated in Uganda. It was the beginning of the 1980s, and back then, Uganda was in the middle of a civil war, and Kagame, along with other Rwandan refugees, fought the Ugandan government, and they won. And this is how Kagame, as a military legend, was born. In the 1990s, he would lead other attacks against the Hutu-led Rwandan government. But the turning point was in 1994, 100 days after that horrific massacre on April the 6th. Kagame was making his entrance in Kigali, the Rwandan capital, with 2,500 soldiers. The genocide was over, and Rwanda, it had a new government. This time, it was a Tutsi-led government, with Kagame serving as the vice president. But hold on just a second, because the story, it doesn't just end here. Because imagine the scenario. For one, he had to help lead a divided country where genocide survivors had to live next to the neighbors that had killed their friends and family. And it didn't help that Rwanda was one of the 10 poorest countries on Earth, with few resources to export. And on top of all of that, this brand new Tutsi government was not an example of transparency and respect for human rights. As you can imagine, many of the soldiers who had taken over Kigali, they wanted revenge. And, well, during the next year, no one made an effort to stop the executions and the unfair trials. If this wasn't enough, many ministers tried to use their positions to fill their pockets with the little money that Rwanda had. Corruption was certainly on the rise. Meanwhile, Paul Kagame had the charisma, the popular support, and especially the political ambition to rise even higher. And this is why in March of 2000 the Hutu president resigned. And without an election, well, the inevitable happened.
Kagame, the eternal president.
In the year 2000, Paul Kagame became the new Rwandan president, and he came to power with two clear goals. The first one was to unify the Rwandan people after the genocide. The second was to pull his country out of poverty. So what did he do to achieve this latter goal? Well, he traveled a lot. Kagame created an advisory team that went to countries like China, Thailand, and Singapore. So can you guess what those three places, what do they have in common? Well, the answer is that they were countries that used to be poor, and back then they were emerging nations. Kagame arranged meetings with politicians, economists, and civil servants, and from these meetings he wrote down scores of ideas in a notebook. Then he returned with the golden formula to build a wealthy country.
This notebook became the foundation for the brand new Rwandan constitution and, more importantly, Vision 2020. Basically, Vision 2020 was a government development plan launched by Paul Kagame with the goal of transforming Rwanda into a middle-income country in just 2 decades. Modern, peaceful country where extreme poverty no longer existed.
But wait just a minute, because this isn't the normal buzzword-filled speech of a politician. Rwanda's Vision 2020 had 44 clear and accountable goals. For instance, it said that by the year 2020, 1 in every 3 Rwandans must have electricity at home. Both the government and private consultancy firms are analyzing and measuring the progress of all of these goals. So let's take a look at an example. One of those targets was to make Rwanda a gender equality haven. And now the Rwandan constitution requires that at least 50% of all government positions be held by women. In fact, at the time of making this video, the Rwandan parliament has the biggest share of female MPs in the entire world, and the wage gap between men and women is lower than in countries as progressive as Denmark. Today, there is a brand new generation of female Rwandan entrepreneurs leading the country. And what's more, Rwanda is investing the small amount of money they collect in taxes pretty wisely. In a country where 80% of its population used to live off subsistence farming, the government has built power generators and roads that increase agricultural productivity. Now Rwandan farmers are beginning to export food to their neighbors. All of this explains why, 23 years after the genocide, Rwanda's GDP is growing at an average rate of 8% a year. This is similar to emerging economies like China or Vietnam.
On the same streets where, in 1994, people were clubbing each other to death, startups like Rwanda Motorcycle Company are being born. The motorcycle factory was created this year, in 2017, with American investment. If you want to start a company in neighboring countries, you will need weeks or even months to deal with all the paperwork. In Rwanda, you're done with all that in just 2 days.
And of course, this has attracted a lot of foreign investors, especially from China and America. And so now you might be wondering, how did they end up here? What's Paul Kagame's secret? Well, dear viewer, the answer, it has a light side, but it also has a dark side.
Tolerance at gunpoint.
Everyone believes it. Rwanda works. Streets are safe and tolerance between Hutus and Tutsis is imposed by law. The Rwandan constitution itself forbids the use of the words Tutsi and Hutu to refer to a person. According to the government, all citizens are Rwandans and no one should care about their tribe of origin. Neither the media nor institutions are allowed to say anything that could spark hatred or open past scars. And, well, in fact, they can't even criticize the government. Both the police and the military, they are present all over the country to make sure that everyone follows these laws. Yeah, it is true, Paul Kagame is a popular president. Indeed, he has his own YouTube channel and a Twitter and Facebook account that he uses almost daily, but no one else has the freedom to express their ideas freely. And, well, the same goes for other political parties. We're talking about a president who's been in power for 17 years and who wins elections with outcomes higher than 95% of the vote. As you can imagine, this is not exactly democratic.
One of his opponents, Frank Habineza of the only permitted opposition party, hailed the process. He had attempted to run for the 2010 presidential election, but his party was unable to register for the vote.
In other words, the Rwandan model is based on 3 pillars: ease of investing and doing business, infrastructure development, and at the top, an authoritarian government that guarantees safety and tolerance at the expense of other human rights. Well, now we want to know what your opinion is. Do you think that this lack of democracy is legitimate if the country can step out of poverty? Or perhaps Rwanda would be better off if they structured the country in a more democratic and Western model? Well, please leave your answer in the comments section below. And if you do want to learn more about the history of another African country, click on this video where I talk about Angola, which is the world's most expensive country. I've also recently started a new channel, Biographics, where we look at biographies from famous people throughout history as well as the present day. We've got some politicians on there, but also business people and other famous and notable people. So please do check it out. There's a link in the description below. Also, please do visit our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. You can find them at reconsidermedia.com. They provide the vocals in this video that are not mine. And don't forget, we publish brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday. So please do subscribe and hit that thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.